Hello there, Quillers. What we're going to be talking about today is how to use what's called a quilling grid or a snowflake grid. And I want to start by talking about why we use this item in quilling. A lot of times in quilling, we're making a circular item such as a flower, for example, this flower that I made, or something that's circular and even more complicated like an ornament. A lot of quillers make ornaments, and you can see in the snowflake ornament, it's got a similar design to the flower in the sense that both of them have a series of elements or shapes that are arranged around a center in a circle. So a snowflake grid or a quilling grid helps us to get around this problem of getting these identical pieces evenly spaced around a center point, as you see in both of these designs. So we need some way to help us keep the items evenly spaced as we're gluing them together to form one piece, like a flower or a snowflake. The solution is to use this tool that is called a quilling grid or a snowflake grid or a circular grid. All of those terms are kind of interchangeable for our purposes today. And the goal of this video is to show you how to use this grid to space pieces in the formation or creation of something like a flower or a snowflake. So you can see that this grid has a series of pre-marked patterns that will help us keep things in a consistent spacing and position. So what I'll be showing you today is how to make two different types of flowers using this grid. The first one is a little bit easier, and it's probably the type of design that you'll use more often, at least when you're first starting out. So let's get started. So let's start by looking at what materials you need before you get started on this project. The first thing you need is the grid itself, and for those of you in my quilling class, you will find this in the left pocket of your course materials folder. So this is a grid that I downloaded from another quiller named Cecilia Louie. She has a very nice website, especially for beginners, but not exclusively for beginners. She's really an expert quiller who has some good videos on other processes such as using glue and so forth. But this is a very typical grid that you'll find a lot of these on the internet. You may want to make a copy of yours first while it's still intact because you will develop pinholes in this copy as soon as you start to use it. So it's nice to have a clean copy that you can duplicate over and over. If you do need to find another grid on the internet, you can simply Google something like circle grid for quilling, and a lot of them will pop up that are available to print down. The second thing you need is your cork board, and this is on the back of your shape board. So you do need something cork because you're going to be able, you need to be able to put pins into it. And what we're going to be doing is working with this grid on top of the cork board like this. And before we start working, we also need something, since we're going to be working with glue, we need something to protect the grid from getting glue on it, because we don't want our pieces to stick to the grid itself. And there are a couple of options for this. What I'll be using today is a sheet of this cling film called Glad Press and Seal, which works very nicely. You can also use wax paper. And if you're really ambitious, what I've done with one of my grids is to laminate it. I cut it off because I don't really need the information at the bottom myself. And I laminated the remainder so that I can use it over and over again without having to apply a separate item to it every time. But you'll probably be using something like cling film or wax paper, so I'll show you what to do with that. You need about an 8 to 10 inch, no larger, piece of it, and you simply want to lay it flat on top of the grid. So I've got my grid more or less centered on the cork board. My working area is going to be right in here, so I want to make sure I have access to that with plenty of cork under it. And I can also take a straight pin or two and just put those in the top or bottom to stabilize it so that it doesn't move around while I'm working. When you're picking your material to cover the grid with, the main things you want to remember are that, first of all, it's got to be transparent because you need to be able to see the grid underneath the material. Second, it has to be thin enough to pin through. So for example, something like a pane of glass would be transparent, but we wouldn't be able to get a pin through it. This laminated version I've got is about as thick as I want it to be. I don't want it to be any thicker because it is a little more challenging to get a pin through this acetate than through this thinner cling film here. The most important thing is it has to be glue resistant, and this cling film and wax paper and something like acetate or lamination sheet, all of those resist the glue drying and sticking to them, which is important because eventually some glue will seep through usually, and we want to be able to get our finished piece off of this surface after it's all put together. So those are the things to keep in mind when you're covering your grid. The next thing we need are some straight pins, and you should have a box of these in your quilling kit. These have little heads in them on them, making them easier to insert and remove. You need about 15 of those for this project, no more. And I like to put them in a little dish. If you have a little pin cushion holder for your wrist, that would be very handy too. You just need some way to pick them up easily as you're working. You need your glue in the needle nose applicator, and I've got mine standing by in my cup with the sponge, moistened sponge in it that I will keep over here to the side, so I've got easy access to it. A couple of tools I like to have on hand in case I need them are my tweezers. Sometimes I need these to pick up pieces or move them around. And second, the stylus tip that's on the opposite end of your quilling needle. So this again is useful for maybe pushing pieces around or adjusting the spacing of them a little bit, and also for picking up glue that might go astray. Another thing I like to have on hand are some Q-tips, and these are also what I use to pick up glue in case any gets around the piece and I need to clean it up. And I recently discovered this last year, these pointed Q-tips. You can find them at a store like Target. I also found some in the dollar store. And they're a little more expensive than conventional Q-tips, but they work a lot better for quilling because that point lets you get into smaller spaces than a round tip would. So I'm going to take these and put them over here on the side in the same dish that I've got my pins in, and that way I only have to worry about one item over there holding both things. The last thing I need is something like an old business card or simply a scrap piece of cardstock. We'll be using this later on as kind of a spatula, so I'll set that aside for now, but I do have it at hand. So I've got all my equipment ready, and I've got it laid out on a flat surface so that I can reach everything easily as I'm working. I don't want to have to stop and go find a piece of equipment once I've started. The last thing I need are the components for the piece I'm making. And the first piece I'm going to make for you today is a flower that has 6 petals. So I've gone ahead and made those petals. For each of them was made according to the instructions I gave you on your handout. They were made from 15mm circles, and these were formed into a marquise or I shape, EYE shape. Well, first of all, let me say these have to be made in advance because remember, I'm using my shape board. I'm using the back of that today as my corkboard surface. So I don't have access to my 15mm circle temporarily. So I need to have these shapes already made before I get started. The other thing I want to point out to you that we haven't talked about yet with respect to circular shapes is generally when you are working on a circular shape like a flower or a snowflake, you want to make sure that all of the coils in the center are turning in the same direction. So this gets us back to this idea of symmetry. When we talked about making a 2-piece heart, I said that the pieces should be mirror images of each other, meaning that the center coils should be turning in opposite directions. So if you look at this particular example, I'm not sure if you can see the detail, but the piece on my left, on this side, the center coil is turning to the right. So it's turning clockwise. The piece on my right is turning to the left. It's turning counterclockwise. So the main thing is they're turning in opposite directions. They're mirror images of each other. That's what you want when you have a piece with just 2 sides to it. a right and a left. A circle doesn't really have a right and a left. It's one continuous motion. So we want to get all of our coils going in one direction, either clockwise or counterclockwise. It doesn't really matter, just so they're all turning the same way. So I'm going to examine each piece. These have been in a box, so they might be kind of jumbled up. And I'm just going to make an arbitrary decision. I'm going to have them all turning counterclockwise to the left. So that one's to the left. That one's to the left. This one's turning to the left. This one's turning to the right, so I'm going to flip it over. Now it's turning to the left. This one's turning to the right, so I will flip it over, and now it's turning to the left. And this one is turning to the left. So all of my pieces are lined up and ready to go in the correct orientation. They're all turning left or counterclockwise. So I don't want to have to do that in the middle of my work process. I want to get them lined up that way at the beginning so that I can work a little bit more smoothly. So just to show you one more example or two, here's a finished piece that you may be able to see the center of a little more clearly since it uses kind of looser coils. But you can see that all of the petals in this flower, if you look at the center pieces, they are all turning to the left. So they're all lined up consistently. I do want to show you on this snowflake, this is kind of an interesting example because the snowflake has two types of symmetry going on in it. If you look at the color pieces that form the center of the snowflake, again, these are all turning to the left. So they are all consistently turning counterclockwise. You can also see though that this piece, put a little contrasting color under it, this piece also has some hearts in it. So each of those hearts has that mirror image symmetry. So in this particular heart, this piece is turning to the right and this piece is turning to the left. So the hearts have mirror image symmetry, but the color pieces have that circular symmetry. And then our outermost piece is this little, the end of the arm, the tip here. These pieces again are all turning counterclockwise in the same direction as these color pieces. So the snowflake's kind of an interesting example because it can show you both types of symmetry at work in one piece. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started with this first type of flower. This is going to be a flower where the petals form a base and then the flower center is placed on top of that base at the end. And I do also have my flower center completed and ready to go, so I'll put him right over there. So I've got all my petals ready and I've got my flower center ready. So in this particular piece, what I'm going to do to get started, I've already done the first few steps. I've turned my shape board so that my cork board is facing up. I put my grid on top of the cork board so that the center of it is about in the center of the cork board itself. And I've put my wax paper or cling film on top of the grid and I've secured it into place to keep it from sliding around with these pins. So what I'm going to do is start by forming the base of the flower, and that consists of these 6 red petals that will meet in the center. Before I get started, I want to plan for where I'm going to put these petals, how I'm going to use my grid. I know that I have 6 petals, so that I will need to find 6 lines that go through the center of the grid. And this grid and a lot of quilling grids are set up for multiples of 6. The reason being that snowflakes have 6 sides or 6 arms to them. And a lot of us make snowflakes. 6 petals on a flower is also a nice number. It kind of fills out a small shape nicely. So on this grid, I've already got those 6 arms already marked out. I can use either these solid red lines like here, or I can use the dotted red lines like here. If I were going to make a piece with 12 items in it, I would need both, and I'll just show you a quick example here. This little magnet I made with a poinsettia, this actually has 6 larger pieces and then 6 smaller petals, so a total of 12. So that I did actually use both the solid and the dotted lines when I laid out this particular piece. But today we just need 6 of those lines, so I will pick the solid red lines since those are obviously easier to see than the dotted ones are. If you do run across a case where you need a grid that has, say, 5 arms on it, you would need to search for something like that on the internet. It's fairly easy to find, but you'll find that most grids are divided into an even number usually. 6 is very common. You might also find one with 8 sides to it. But the 6 is probably your most versatile size or layout. I'm going to start by pinning one of my marquise shapes so that I follow 2 guidelines, and this will hold true for each shape that I pin. First of all, one of the points of the marquise is going to touch the center of the grid. So the center point, I need to get it on or very close to that center point. And second, the marquise has 2 points. I want them following the angle of this red line that I've started with. So it's really important to get this first shape oriented properly because it kind of has a domino effect on your other shapes. So I'm going to pin this piece in 2 places. First of all, I'm going to pin it near the center with one of my straight pins. So I'm pinning it very close to that inside point. And second, I'm going to take another straight pin and put it on the other point, making sure again when I look at it from the top that it is following that red line quite straightly. So that's good to go. Next, I'm going to just start pinning down the other shapes. What I find is that when I'm starting a shape, it helps to place my second piece opposite the first piece rather than next to it. This just seems to keep the pieces a little more stable and balanced as I get the piece started. The only thing I'm going to add to this piece is I'm going to put a drop of glue, very small drop, onto the inside tip. And it's important to see that I'm not putting it on the bottom of the piece. I'm putting it on the side of the piece that's going to touch the other petal, my first petal. So I've got my glue on there, and I'm just going to move those so that they kind of kiss each other. And then again, I'm going to take a pin and secure the middle point of that second piece, making sure it's touching that first piece. And then I'm going to take another pin and glue my outside shape. So right now I've got 4 pins going, 2 on each piece. Next, I'm going to just start filling in the other petals as I go around the grid. And again, I will start with a little glue on the tip of this third piece. And this time, since I'm gluing it, wherever I glue it, I'm going to be next to one of the other pieces. And the side that's going to touch that other piece, I'm going to put a little bit of glue over there too. And that will help to stabilize the pieces. So again, I'm putting the inside tip at the middle, and I'm going to pin that. And then I'm making sure that I'm staying on my line here. And pinning this along here. What you would find if you tried this without a grid or without the pins, the pieces would start very subtly but noticeably pushing each other kind of around the grid, and you wouldn't get that even spacing that we're going to get by taking the time to use the pins. I will take one of my opposite numbers here and again add a little glue. Use my tweezers to help me get it in place. And once it's in place, I will again pin it to hold it there. And just 2 more to go. This time I'm going to be touching 2 pieces, one on the right and one on the left, so I'll put a little glue on both sides of this piece that I'm adding. And this is coming together nicely in the middle. And then finally this last petal. One thing to check as you're gluing, occasionally you may get one of these pieces kind of popping up a little bit, so you want to make sure that the piece is level all the way around, and you can use your tweezers kind of on the side to make sure there's not a piece out of alignment on the up and down level. But when I look down at this from the top, I don't want to get my head in the video here, but I'm going to look right down on it. I'm just double checking to make sure each of these is indeed on that red line, and it looks pretty accurate at this point. So I'm going to let that dry for about 10 minutes. And one last thing before I do that is I'm going to remove these center pins, and I'm going to add my center piece so that that can dry too. You might have noticed when I took out the center pins, I kind of held each piece down when I did that, because sometimes the act of pulling out the pin will sort of uncoil the piece, so you want to make sure that doesn't happen. I created a dome with this piece, and I'm going to add some glue to it on the bottom, and I will use my tweezers to place this in the center. One thing I can do is put a pin through the center, find the center of my flower, and this way I can be assured that I am indeed lining it up right in the center. So I'll use a pin to kind of hold that in place. But the centerpiece of this flower is going to add another level of stability to the entire piece, because now you've got glue holding the points of the petals together, you've got some glue on the side of each petal, and then you've got glue on the bottom of this centerpiece. So this is going to be a very stable flower when it's done. So I'm going to let that dry for, about 10 minutes and then come back. Okay, this piece has now been drying for about a little more than 10 minutes, about 12 or 13 minutes. And that means it's not totally 100% dry, but it's dry enough for me to remove it from the surface without breaking it apart. So what I'm going to need for this step is the little piece of cardstock that I had earlier. You can also use something like an old business card. That works fine too. You want something that's got a little bit of rigidity to it, but it's not too thick. So cardstock is a good solution there. So what I'm going to start by doing is removing each of the pins. And again, as I remove the pin from one of the petals, I'm going to hold the petal down with my finger or with my tweezers so that it doesn't come uncoiled when I remove the pin. So I'm going to start by just going around and removing all of the pins. And what you'll find is sometimes, even though you're not gluing to the bottom of the piece, it's not uncommon for glue to sort of seep through the piece and get on the bottom, because we do have holes or spaces in quilling pieces where glue can kind of escape through. So you might find that the piece is a little tiny bit sticking to the surface. You might be able to gently dislodge it with your finger. If you can't do that, you can sort of run your piece of cardstock under it and lift the piece off. So there I have my nice finished flower, and I'm going to set this aside and let it finish drying completely and undisturbed. A lot of times when you're making flowers or ornaments, you want to be able to use the corkboard again right away, so that's why we're not just letting this dry for 24 hours on the corkboard. Also, if there is glue underneath, the longer we let it dry, the harder it's going to be to get the piece off. Even though this will resist the glue a little bit, we don't want to let it go too far. So we usually want to let the piece dry for 10 to 15 minutes, take it off, and then let it finish drying off to the side. Okay, for the second piece, I'm going to be making a second type of flower. It's a little bit different from the first one. In the first one, we saw that the petals of the flower were glued together so that they come to a point in the middle, and they each have some glue on the sides holding them to the adjacent piece. And then at the end, the center piece was glued on top of the flower. The one we're going to make now is a little bit different. It's a little bit more delicate than the first type of flower. It's a flower where the petals are attached around the center of the flower instead of under the center of the flower. So it's going to start out in the same way as our first one did. I'm going to start by having my cork board cork side up, the opposite side of my shape board again. And then I'm going to cover that with my grid. This time I'll be using my laminated grid so you can see how that works. By the way, you may be wondering why we're not simply using, if you have a cork board with a circular grid on the back of that, why don't you just put a piece of saran wrap or wax paper over that and use that as your background? You can certainly do that. I find that it's a little easier for me to see the lines and other markings on the grid when they're against a white background. It gives me a little more contrast, both with the lines against the background and then with the grid itself against the colors of the shape. So I just prefer to use this brighter background. It helps me see a little bit better. So I'm going to start by putting my circle grid on the cork board approximately in the center as I did the last time. So I've got my same tools at hand. I've got my tweezers, my stylus, my pins and Q-tips, and my needle tip glue bottle ready to go. So I'm all set up here on my flat surface just as I was the last time. So since this flower has a center piece that forms the middle of it, I'm going to start by placing that piece at the center of the circle grid. And this is how you start anytime your design has a centerpiece. Sometimes you might be doing a snowflake that has a similar structure to this one. The easiest way for me to do this is to start by inserting a pin through the middle of the centerpiece and then pinning that to the board. So it's a little easier for me to find the center with this pinpoint, and then I just let the centerpiece drop down and I've got it perfectly centered. So if I look down on this from above, I can see that I'm exactly at the intersection of those 6 solid red lines that are going to be my target, so to speak. Next, I'm going to start pinning the petals around the centerpiece. And again, I've started by turning my petals so that the coils are all going in the same direction. Again, I'm doing them counterclockwise, but you could do them clockwise as well. It really doesn't matter as long as they're consistent with each other. Again, I need to find my 6 lines that I'll be using, and I'll use the 6 solid red lines again since they're easier to see. This one starts off, I'm going to take one of my petal pieces and I'm going to place a drop of glue on the tip, one tip of that first petal piece, and this is going to be the point where it meets the centerpiece. So I'm going to place it on one of my red lines and have it meet the centerpiece, and make sure that the other end of my marquise is aligned along that solid red line. And then I will keep it in place with 2 pins, one at each end. Okay. And again, you have to be careful. Sometimes your centerpiece may want to pop up a little bit because there's really nothing holding it down at this point except a tiny drop of glue. So you want to keep checking that and making sure everything is staying flat and at the same level against your grid. Next, I'm going to start pinning down the other marquise shapes, the other petals. And this will be a little bit different from our first flower because these petals are not going to touch each other on the side. The only thing that's going to be holding them together is this little drop of glue that goes onto the center piece. So again, I'm going to start by working one of the opposite sides, or the opposite side, there's only one, and I will put a pin on the inside point, and once I've got it lined up properly, put a second pin at the outside point. So now I have a total of 5 pins, one holding down my center piece and then 2 each on these marquise shapes opposite each other. And again, I'm not gluing each petal to the grid, I'm only gluing it at the tip to the center of the flower, the yellow part in this case. And I'll just keep working my way around the flower. Again, I'm putting a drop of glue at the tip each time. I have to be a little more careful with my alignment because I don't have the adjacent flower to kind of lean up against and keep the piece in line. It's just the only thing holding it are these pins and that little drop of glue in the middle. You can see there's a little space between the petals here in this particular flower because the petals don't quite fill out the space that's there. Rotated the entire board so I could get access to that side a little more easily, and then I will pin that down. Two more to go. Same process. And I don't know if you can see this, but I put a little too much glue on that last tip, so I'm just gonna, first of all, I'm gonna make sure my pieces are all level. I'm gonna go in there with my Q-tip and just gently wipe up that extra glue so it doesn't show once the piece is dry. Okay. This piece, I'm going to let it dry probably for about 15 minutes. The reason is that, as with the first piece, I want to let it dry enough so that it's stable enough for me to take off of the grid. But the piece I'm working on now, this aqua colored piece, needs a little more drying time because it has less glue holding it together than our first piece does. Our first piece, we had glue in 3 places. We had it in the middle where the points met. They were each glued to the opposite petal at the middle point. Second, we had some glue along the sides of each piece. And third, we had glue on the bottom of the center piece that kind of holds the whole set of petals together. In contrast, on this aqua petal, the only place holding the petals on is this one point. So we've got 6 points of glue there, but it's a very small amount of glue. So I want to let it dry a little longer to make sure that the piece is stable enough. So I'll check back on it in about 15 minutes. Okay, so now this piece has dried for about 15 minutes, maybe a little longer. So once again, I'm going to take the pins out carefully and hold each petal down while I'm pulling the pin up. Let's see how this comes out. Okay, I'm going to take my piece of cardstock or my business card, just like I had on the last one, and I'm home free on this one because none of the glue leaked through to the bottom of the piece. So one of my coils is a little bit springy. That's not anything to do with how I glued it. It's just a little bit of a flaw in the quilling itself, but I'll be able to fix that once I glue the flower down to the surface I'll be using it on, so I'm not too worried about that. But you can see that this again is a little bit more delicate than our first piece because there just aren't as many points where glue is holding it together. So it's also a little bit larger than our first piece. If I put these two pieces on top of each other, you'll be able to see that the aqua piece is just a tiny bit larger because the petals are coming out from the centerpiece. So now I have my two finished pieces showing you these two different types of flowers. The first one where the centerpiece covers the petals, and the second where the centerpiece forms the center for the petals, and the petals are attached to its side rather than underneath it as in the first piece. So I think you're ready to try using your grid board at home to practice with some of the petal shapes you've been making, and see if you can use your grid board and some saran wrapper wax paper and your pins to help you practice putting together one of these circular designs. Have fun.